And we also have to factor in that Ukraine and Russia share on global trade. They're a huge agricultural producer in cereals, oil crops, wheat, the largest supplier of sunflower oil, all of that, and the fact that the global food crisis on the near horizon and Europe's cost of living is skyrocketing. Empty shelf warning as the double impact of drought and gas prices cause food crisis, along with that the UN food head warns conditions worse than Arab Spring as inflation riots begin to spread all over Bangladesh. We're seeing it happen in the Middle East. We're seeing it in Egypt. Again, we're seeing all these, right? I'm not going to list them all out, but we're going to see this happen in Europe. It's going to start happening in Europe, right? So if we look at the partial solar eclipse of the Ukraine horoscope, we could see that eclipse making a direct hit to the natal Saturn. And this is all happening with the USA Pluto return, 3 of 3. Look at where Pluto is going through. This is the USA Pluto return. And we look at where Pluto is moving right through Kiev, Moscow. So we could see here, everything is pointing now to Ukraine, right? Russia's war in Ukraine continues to drag on. Ukraine's military will continue to resist Russian advances, but we're going to see some very interesting developments. Now, Ukraine actually achieved some very interesting victories, significant victories in the Russian-controlled Ukrainian territory. But what was more important about what they achieved is not so much the land, some of the square mile footage that they got back in terms of territory gain, but they amassed more Russian equipment. The Russians basically left. They actually abandoned their military depots of equipment. And so the Ukrainians got more equipment from Russia, state-of-the-art Russian equipment they can readily use against the Russians. And the number is so big, it's more than all of the entire Ukrainian military, plus all the weapons that were shipped over to Ukraine at the beginning of the crisis. So what's significant about the fact that we had these small but significant Ukrainian military victories is the fact that the Russians have basically left Ukraine with enough weaponry to theoretically take back the entire territory. So not that they may have the manpower, they don't have the manpower, right? They don't necessarily have the manpower to take it all back against the Russians, but theoretically now it's a game changer. So now the Russians, right? The Ukraine's going to conserve their manpower. The real issue has to do with what Russia is going to do next. Russia has 3 options: to completely back off and call the war over, right? Or come to a ceasefire and then pull out. That would likely result in Putin's assassination, Putin's downfall, and probably assassination of himself, his family, all his comrades, all his alliances, right? Because that's how Russia works. Historically, if you look at that, that's how it worked in the Soviet Union. That's worked in Tsarist Russia. So it's highly unlikely Putin will do that. That's one option. The other option is to seek a mass mobilization later this year, around the time of the Pluto return, or in early 2023. Now, people would say that's a low probability scenario, that he's not going to do a mass mobilization. He's going to basically officially declare war on Ukraine. And then basically, every man between 18 and 58 years of age would be mobilized and trained and basically having an all-out invasion, full-blown war, right? The type of what we saw occur in World War II, right? So that's the mass mobilization option. The other option is the one now being discussed by American military analysts, that Russia may be planning to use tactical nuclear weapons in a counteroffensive, because Putin may use these weapons if he is too desperate amid a devastating, significant a strategic setback. So if he's having a devastating war loss due to a significant strategic setback, which recently occurred, you're seeing now U.S. former general, Army U.S. Brigadier General Kevin Ryan. He served as the defense attaché to Russia and said Putin must be thinking about doing something dramatic in the face of a rapid Ukrainian counterattack that is continuing to gain ground, right? Large number of Russian troops have surrendered rather than fight the Ukrainian troops advancing east out of Kharkiv, leading some to hope that a turning point in the war has finally been reached. But the success of Ukraine's counteroffensive could mean that Putin will launch tactical battlefield nuclear weapons. So this is the scenario that we're seeing being played out here. And this is being given serious consideration. The escalation vortex is a term that's used in geopolitics and military strategy. And it's a visualization of potential conflict between nuclear states. Pluto rules escalation vortexes. And this was developed back between 2010 and 2015 by a U.S. Air Force Global Strikes Command Center by a chief scientist, and essentially saying that the vertical aspects of the escalation ladder of the escalation vortex incorporates horizontal movement among various domains of modern warfare: space, cyber, conventional, nuclear. So what we could see here is the current escalation philosophy. Which nation has more resistance to use nuclear weapons, right? So the higher it is, the more resistance there is to use nuclear weapons in a escalation scenario. So what is their escalation philosophy? Where we would see, for instance, Russia's resistance to use nuclear weapons is much lower than the US. They're more likely to, much more likely to, right? So that's one factor. The other is the cross-domain escalation. We can see how there would be a response. What would be the conventional response, the nuclear escalation response, cyber escalation, space escalation. These are all factors that are looked at in the escalation vortex. Now, this has been brought up because the prologue to the Third World War, Ukraine wants a NATO-esque bloc that can be called upon to immediately defend borders with Russia. This would include the US and other NATO allies, providing Ukraine with a security guarantee, right? And it's not a replacement for NATO, but is a legally binding alliance to be in place while Ukraine pursues full NATO membership. So now this is what's being called in. The Kremlin's reaction was very swift and fierce, with their chairman of security, Dmitry Medvedev. He warned that what is now being stated and considered by America and by NATO is really a prologue to a third world war if it gets enacted. So he described that a nuclear holocaust would be the end result. So this is where we're at. We got the third Pluto return, right? Just want to remind everyone, right? We see that Pluto line crossing here. We look at that Mars-Pluto intersection right over Ukraine. You cannot get any clearer than that. And what is the possible response? So if Russia were to lose a major battle in Donbass, if they lose another major significant battle, or if the Ukrainian counteroffensive seems to be on the verge of a great victory, overtaking all the territory Russia achieved since February, then Putin might well order the use of nuclear weapons to obtain a surrender or ceasefire. If Russia uses a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, an American nuclear retaliation would be the last resort. Some sort of horizontal escalation instead would be more likely, in order to do everything possible to avoid a nuclear exchange between Russia and the United States. So Russia, right? Russia hits Ukraine, for example, with a nuclear cruise missile launched from a ship, and the United States would respond by immediately sinking that ship, right? The number of Ukrainian casualties would determine the severity of the American response, and any escalation would be conducted solely with conventional weapons. For example, Russia's Black Sea Fleet might be sunk in retaliation, and a no-fly zone could be imposed over Ukraine, even if it meant destroying anti-aircraft units on Russian soil. So this is exactly the scenario. This is a likely scenario. Like what would happen if they use a nuclear cruise missile, fired it, and basically said, forced a ceasefire or an unconditional surrender. So you're going to see the U.S. would likely launch a crippling cyber attack on the Russian command and control systems tied to the nuclear assault systems they have, imposing a no-fly zone in eastern Ukraine, the sinking of Russia's Black Sea Fleet in retaliation, the imposing a global sea and air embargo on all Russian sea vessels and aircraft worldwide. The U.S. has the ability to do this, NATO and the U.S., mainly the U.S., right? Deployment of military jets in Ukraine and the deployment of deep strike HIMARS rocket launch systems. These are not the short-term or medium-term, deep strike that could just strike into Russian territory, giving them to Ukraine. So these are the scenarios, right? This is the scenario we see unfolding
To watch
here.
the full presentation and more like this on geopolitics, the economy, and world events from an archetypal and mundane astrological perspective, join the Global Transformation Astrology membership. Go to gta.williamstickevers.com. Become a GTA member today.